If a city works well for children and families, it works for everyone. The most simple example is if you're going to build a bike lane in your city, if you think that your 3-year-old and a parent can ride that bike together in that bike lane, then you've designed a good bike lane. Same with sidewalks. If you have a sidewalk where a parent or a family can stroll with a stroller, you've got the ramps in place, you've made it easy for them to have places to sit, to feed children. In the design, you're thinking of a universal design, right? Like you're thinking of a design that serves all age groups.
Before we go into the podcast, if you could just go and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to it makes a huge difference to the podcast, the amazing conversations we get to have, and the incredible guests we're able to get on the podcast. So it's probably not something you would think about, but if you could just go rate the show, follow it, or share an episode, it does make a huge difference to the show. Thank you so much. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. If you're a parent, a grandparent, or a caregiver, you already know cities were not built with you in mind. 1/3 of all city trips are for caregiving. So why are we still designing cities around commuting? Ankita Chachra has spent her career asking questions like this and designing better answers. From Delhi to The Hague to Brooklyn, she has seen how small choices in city design, like where a bench goes, what material covers a playground, or how fast a car can drive, have a huge impact on how safe, connected, and livable our cities really are, especially for children and families. She believes that if a city isn't built for kids, it's probably not built for you either. And in this conversation, she explains how designing for care isn't just good policy, it's radical, urgent, and incredibly practical. You will never look at a bike lane, bench, or sidewalk the same way again. Thank you, Ankita, for joining me. It's a pleasure having you today. Now, I want to start at the very beginning. What is the earliest experience or realization in your life that led you to care about cities, children, and sustainability?
Well, that's a deep question, because I would say that it's been 3 different moments. So I studied architecture in India, and one of the reasons that I wanted to study architecture when I was younger was that I had a friend, who I used to dance with, and I was just fascinated by all these different subjects that she was studying, and from arts to psychology to construction to physics to theory of physics and theory of structure. So that was very fascinating for me. And then throughout architecture school, I said, I don't want to study urbanism. I'm going to be an architect. And then little did I know, from the first time that I started exposing myself to urban design, I felt a very strong affinity to it, because I was solving problems. And so all the time, the 4 years that I said, I'm just going to do architecture, and, I don't understand, why would you do urban design? I found myself wanting to do masters in urban design. So that's how the cities aspect came into being, because it was really, and again, this was me studying in Gurgaon, which is a kind of a suburb of Delhi, but also a city of its own. So it's the satellite city that was never really designed or planned. And so you see all these interstitial spaces, you see people using the space in certain ways, and also, the uses that are not meant for it, but still because of just the need for public space and streets. So that was really interesting for me to really look at the city as a problem, as a way to solve problem and to improve people's lives. And then I would say the sustainability lens and And the children lens came later on. I was working on global designing cities initiatives, designing streets for kids program, and early on we started talking about young children, so 0 to 3, and caregivers. And I think for me, that was a moment of um, almost realization that when we're talking about young children, especially 0 to 3, we're talking about brain development. We're talking about the way they navigate their future and their being as adults is formed in those early years. But it wasn't just about their development; it was also about the caregiver. So the gender piece that I'd always been attracted to really came forward. So for me, the children and the caregiver part came later. And sustainability goes hand in hand, and we'll talk about it more today. But for me, there were these distinct moments from architecture to urban design, and then children and families.
This really reflects your love for this multidisciplinary field. Cool story. Now, you've worked globally from India to the Netherlands to New York. How has moving across cultures shaped your understanding of what child-friendly city really is?
I would say that it's been interesting to understand how our culture and our approach to child development and child raising or family. I don't want to say policy, but our approach to how we think of families really starts to reflect in the designs and the way you see infrastructure for children and families in cities. So, for example, growing up in India, and I always take this comparison to being in New York now, children are part of everyday life, right? So even if it's 10 p.m. at night, sometimes you'll have children out and about playing in public spaces, in restaurants, and in places that you're at. So there's really this idea of moving as a family unit. So a lot of times, the way that the designs now, and also with more realization in the last 10 to 12 years about public space in Indian cities and kind of revitalizing them and kind of reclaiming them, you see that there's an inherent part of like recognizing that there's this woman and child and caregiver and child relationship. And you see that through whether it's design for play equipment, whether it is just kind of also caregivers, the way they get together, right? And there's always an eye on the child. So it's very different from like seeing children, just from seeing children in the cities to then, in the Netherlands where most children go to sleep at 6 or 7 and, you don't see them after certain hours, but there's a big emphasis on autonomy. So you see children as young as 7 or 8 years old biking on the bike lanes and getting to places without adults even sometimes, right? Or even children as young as 3 or 4 are riding on a balance bike or a small bike with their parents. So you see this shift in the fact that the biking is such a big part of their culture and this autonomy piece is so important to them that you see children using public spaces in different ways. There's also more exposure to nature. At least where I live, there were a lot of like nature and very natural, risky play areas, which you don't tend to see in the US, where we are still, I think, in the playground world, risk averse. We're not exposing our children to enough risk taking. There's a lot of safety and liability issues on how playgrounds are designed. To even like just seeing children in all walks of life, right? Like I think living in Brooklyn, you do tend to see the neighborhood that I'm in, that there are a lot of children. But again, after certain hours, that's it. 7 o'clock onwards, that's it. There are no children outside. And there's a very separation of life of parents and children. So I think these are very cultural pieces that you see and they start to reflect in not only who you see using public spaces, but also how they're designed.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about me when I was a kid. And I grew up in a small town near Zurich in Switzerland, and I would walk to school alone, even though I was like 6 years old. I think the way to school would be for an adult, like a 5-minute walk. And sometimes it would take me half an hour or an hour because I would be like looking at the plants or something like that. And my sister is 7 years younger than me. And when she was a kid, we were already living in Barcelona, which is also a big city. And she would never go to school by herself. And it's so interesting to see how we grew up completely differently. I would spend my afternoons outdoors with my neighbors in the forest. And she had a more controlled way of living, let's say.
Yeah. There's an author, Tim Gill. He's done a lot of work on children's autonomy, and he generally shows this image where he shows the grandfather and like what their distance was and where they lived and where they could explore independently. Then the parent and then the child, right? And it keeps shrinking. So from like a few miles, it goes to like a few blocks to then like just home and outside. And like you said, I think also this is the other piece with our cities today is that we're taking away this autonomy from children to actually, go to school themselves because the streets aren't safe, because you have a lot of cars that are speeding. There's also less trust in how you can compare cultures. And I think there's a very interesting study about Japan where they let children as young as 11 kind of take the subway across the city and move about because there's trust in the society that, something happens, someone would jump in. So there's, of course, the culture aspect, but there's the design, the very inherent design, right? Like the fact that most of our streets are not necessarily designed keeping children and families in mind. It's designed from a very like auto motorized use from one place to the other. Speeds are higher. Our car, especially in the US, the vehicle sizes are getting bigger, which makes the blind spot for being able to see children and stop on time harder. So that's becoming, it's getting even more unsafe for children to be out. So I think, especially for young children, this is now becoming a challenge where we're seeing, and also keeping in mind, post COVID, there's a higher use of screen time use because a lot of children don't even have walkable access to play areas, right? And and if it is it appropriate for their age? Because some playgrounds are designed for sure 5 to 7, but then you have the 7 to teens, you have the age that's before 5, 0 to 3 years old, where they don't have that much mobility but needs a different kind of space. So there are a lot of these other challenges in the way we've designed our cities, not to work for care and caregiving, but definitely to work for, driving and getting to work and commuting.
Do you know if there are any studies about the development later on in their life? Let's say if we go back to my childhood compared to my sister, if there are any studies about the development of our way of working and thinking?
So there are two things. I think the first piece of it, which is this is the early childhood development and the science on early brain science has been really strong, which talks about the experiences and how early childhood experiences influence our brain function, our cognitive function. So, and a lot of it talks more on the sense of the trauma and um, adversity, but also I think there's also this other piece which really looks at how more positive influences, having more access to nature, can help us become better, like from a cognitive perspective, from a physical perspective. Even the small, fine motor skills and gross motor skills are all developed. The foundation of who we are as adults is really formed in those early years. And it's not to say that if you don't have the right exposures, everything's bad, because there's obviously the genetics and then there's the nature and the nurture piece of it. But also we need to recognize that it becomes harder and harder to correct things as we grow older, right? Like the malleability of our brain is the more at its best when we're youngest, because we're really forming these new connections. So as we grow older, it becomes harder. So that's why if you've learned, piano when you were 6 or 7 versus learning piano at 26, it's very different. So that's one, which is like just understanding how valuable that time is and how valuable it is to have more positive influences and positive interactions with our environment. The other piece, which I find really fascinating, is that there was this study done a while back on looking at how people choose how they want to move in a city, right? And it was done, was like a long sectional study looking at those who were exposed to taking transit and biking or walking at a younger age. And then I think there was an age, I don't remember if it was 13 or 26. There were like 3 points, very distinct points, where when you switch, right? Like if say, let's say you did all of that when you were younger, and then around 26, and there's this weird number, you switched and you only depended on cars, and you moved to a very car-oriented city. there's a chance that you would still be open to taking other modes of transportation. And say, so there were like these 3 points in our life age points where if you are exposed to taking walking or biking, then your lifelong habits or your ability to move to a new city and take on, transit and walking would be more, there's a likelihood that you would move to those more sustainable modes of transportation. And I'll have to look up the exact study, but I found that really interesting that when the exposure happens, like in certain periods of your life, and then how your lifelong choices could really depend on those.
That's so interesting. And I would love to at some point look at those numbers. Maybe it's even enough to, let's say, have student cities with bike transportation and bus transportation and more sustainable ways of transportation. Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, in one of your articles, you said cities good for children are cities good for everyone. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I like to say that because I feel that when we're thinking of children, right, we're really setting the bar higher to what we do. So the most simple example is if you're going to build a bike lane in your city, if you think that your 3-year-old and a parent can ride that bike together in that bike lane, then you've designed a good bike lane, which means that even if you're very capable of riding a bike and you've always ridden a bike, it works for you, but it also works for someone who is just learning how to bike or who's really scared of, as an adult, navigating the bike lane. Same with sidewalks. If you have a sidewalk where a parent or a family can stroll with a stroller, you've got the ramps in place. You've made it easy for them to have places to sit, to feed children. Children tend to also have moments where they need to just rest, and caregivers need to rest, especially in the early years of your child's life. Like when if you're as a mother, if you're choosing to breastfeed or even just feed, you have to stop sometimes on your way to like stop and feed and change a diaper and all of that. So you're in the design, you're thinking of a universal design, right? Like you're thinking of a design that serves all age groups, all abilities, and hence, if it works for them, if it works, if a city works well for children and families, it works for everyone. And these are very physical examples. I can also like translate into policy related examples or even proximity to services. Everything that's in a 15-minute or a 10-minute walking distance works for everyone. It works great for everyone. You don't have to rely on a car or wait for really long hours if the transport is not reliable. So that's the way I like to explain it. But it also means that you're designing a city from the perspective of care and caregiving. And I think that's one aspect that often in our lives we don't give enough credit to. And I think, again, during COVID, a lot of people during the lockdown saw the value of care and recognized that it's such an important work. But yet we're not thinking of our cities from that perspective. And even if you just look at transportation, for example, it's, bikes. There's this organization that works on encouraging young children and families to bike. They did this study where they talk about how up to 1/3 of the trips that are taken in the city are caregiving trips. So it's, either to drop your child or to go to the hospital or to, check in on your family member or some activity around care. And we don't think of those 30% of the trips. We only think of the 30% that are for commute.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that. It's a high number.
It is, yeah. Up to 1/3 is a pretty significant number.
Yeah. So you've spoken about how transportation and mobility patterns change when people become caregivers. What are some of the biggest blind spots in how cities accommodate or fail to accommodate parents and young children?
Yeah, and I'll actually also talk a little bit about sustainability here because I think it's related. I think the first thing to recognize is that if you're just a commuter going to your office or work, right, like a typical, and I'm not saying like, of course, there are jobs now that are different hours, etc. But typically our transportation systems, and especially if you think of public transit or even the bike networks and different networks, are designed for to accommodate those hours, those peak hours when people are commuting from home to work and work to home, or those peak networks where you're going from home to the work and work to back. But caregivers and children have different patterns, right? We don't just go from home to work. You might, if you're working and you're dropping your child, you'll go from home to a school maybe, or maybe you stop in the park in the morning and then you go to a school, and then then you'll go to work. Then on your way back, you might pick up your child. You might even stop for groceries. So we tend to trip chain. We don't just take one simple trip from home to work. We tend to stop in different places. That's because you're moving as a unit. And often our systems, just the transportation systems, don't take that into account. So in some cities, it's amazing to see integrated systems where you can do these multiple trips. But in most cities, the way the transit systems have been designed, and you can look at the model of New York City, you can look at Hong Kong, you can look at London, it's this spoke and hub model. So you've got the hub, the work center, and then different places connected. Whereas what we really need is a web. The other piece is also the time. So you have the highest frequencies during these peak hours because you're trying to accommodate most number of users. But caregivers and children, if someone's only caregiving, right, and it might not be working or in a commercial setup, but their main role is to care for the children, they move it off peak hours. So whether it's nannies, whether it's parents, whether it's grandparents who are caring for young children, they don't tend to move at the same hours as the workforce. So that means that you need reliable transportation, even in off-peak hours for them. Then we can go even further down on just how wide the sidewalk is, how smooth the surface is, how slow the speeds are, how much green space do you have, how many times can you actually stop and sit in a bench in a dedicated space. So you can start going down to granular level, and you start to see that the way the movement happens is different. And then, of course, accessibility, which is not only for people with limited mobility, but also very essential for parents and children. So if you have a stroller and I can't take it down the subway, then that subway might not exist, right? So there are these different pieces where I think we don't think of children and families, and also the aspect of proximity. There was a really interesting study that this group called Studio Ludo did recently, that was studying parks and playgrounds across the US. And what they realized was that the proximity of the park to the house, if it was in 10 minutes, it saw more use from the families that lived within that 10-minute radius, which is, to me, it's not we don't need a study for that. Like, it's very obvious, but what it says to you is that especially parents and children, they want to be in a close proximity of a play area to be able to use that because it's convenient, it saves time. You're already, time poor when you're a parent. And also it helps build community. Like my neighborhood park is where I've met all other parents and all other caregivers who are in a similar setup. And there's a level of familiarity. There's a level of solidarity. So I think that neighborhood park and that neighborhood proximity and services is another very key piece when we think of children and families. And then I will say last thing on this and the sustainability piece of it. If we do not provide reliable transportation options and alternatives, that means if parents cannot bike safely with their kids, or if kids cannot bike safely, if the transportation is not reliable or affordable or convenient, the default, and I'm talking about public transportation, the default then oftentimes becomes driving. And I know a lot of parents who never owned a car living, in the neighborhood that I'm in. But once you become a parent, you start thinking, well, maybe this makes sense because, I can't rely and, I can't always be waiting for the bus without knowing how long it will take. Or, I can't walk a 50-minute distance to get something done, or a 30-minute distance with a young child. So you start to then make these choices, whether you end up getting a car or relying more on motorized transportation. And we know that 30% of our emissions today is transportation sector. So if we want to reduce and encourage a modal shift from motorized transport, then our way to do that is to make sure that 1/3 of the care trips can also be done on foot, on bike, or on public transit.
I have recorded over 70 podcast episodes, and right now I'm in active conversations with dozens of potential and future guests. That means outreach, follow-ups, calendar coordination, confirmations, and reminders. It can get chaotic really, really fast. That's why I use Go High Level, the same CRM I trust for my marketing. It keeps all my guest communication in one place, automates what I don't have time for, and makes sure no guest forgets their interview. If you're an architect or you run any kind of service-based business or even host a podcast, I cannot recommend a system like this enough. If you want to try it out, there is a link in the description you can use now to get an extra 2-week trial. I would like to go back to the second point you mentioned with the playgrounds or the proximity of the playgrounds. What about the policies in the US? Because in Switzerland, for example, we have policies around, I'm not sure about the exact regulations. I would have to look that up again. But depending on the size of the building you're planning, you need a certain size of playground and a certain amount of playgrounds and also outdoor community space and that has obviously both of those or several benefits, but within them, the sustainability factor of having enough greenery, but also the community building. And we can also talk about the health of children by playing outdoors and all that. Now, how is the policy aspect in the US?
I can talk about cities, and I think a lot of cities do have land use and land zoning codes where you need a certain amount of amenities and services for a certain number of houses. Like even in New York City, you have to do a study of whether the services and amenities around any big housing development can support the people that are moving in. But I think the question that we need to be asking more than the policy is how is it implemented and translated on the ground? So, of course, you can have a policy that says if I'm putting a building with 500 new units, I need an X amount of open space for children. But how is that open space designed? Where is it placed? Is it on the side where actually you'll get more use? Because, for example, in New York City, you want it to be in the side where there's more sun in the winters, and then it also has some shade elements for the summer. What kind of equipment and what kind of surfaces are you putting in? Like if you're just going to put asphalt and just cover it up and say it's open space, no shade, no seating, and then you put a gate around it because it's privately owned public space, then you're not going to get the use, right? So I think the bigger question is, how does this policy get translated into actual design details that allows use and that can also be not just use, like good use and inspirational use, where it's not just there because it's checking a box, but it's there because it actually adds value to the lives of people that are going to be using it.
Do you have children?
Yes. I have a 3-year-old.
That makes a lot of sense. How did your perspective change after becoming a mother?
When I started working on Designing Streets for Kids program, this was, I think it was 2017. So it was a while back, about 8 years ago. And there are a lot of things that you see and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. You need X, Y, and Z. And I don't think that perspective has changed, but definitely new perspectives have been added having children. And I think the biggest one, actually, there are a few big ones that I think I still kind of feel like is the key. The transportation piece of it, like even today, there are places that don't have accessible subways, or you'll have stairs and, you have a stroller and you're like, this is impossible to try and navigate alone with a child. So sometimes even with the subway, I have to ask for help, and that's fine. People help, but it's not, I don't feel it's a second thought. The other one is that really gets to me now is when you don't have natural elements in a play area where it's only asphalt and concrete, and you don't have a turf or some grass or some mulch or trees in nature, because especially when children are learning how to walk, they're very wobbly. And it is so scary to see them as a parent, walk on this hard concrete surface where you know that they're going to fall because that's how they learn. So to me, not having that green space or not having asphalt as the go-to, and again, also with the way that our weather patterns are changing, we're getting longer summers. our years are getting hotter. 2024 was the hottest year that we know. The playground equipment is not designed to handle that heat. So you'll have slides that are burning because they're in the sun. You have asphalt that is very hot, or material like the rubber that we use that can get extremely hot. So it's so unsafe from a even just physical perspective for children. And I think that piece has been really front of mind for me, the relationship between playing and being outdoors in a changing climate. And how do we design for that? And then I would say, I mean, the sidewalks and the speed of the cars and like the crosswalks not aligned. So those were things that I think always existed, but they become even more evident. And also the seating. I think for me, I was, we traveled a lot of cities when my son was, from 0 to 1 years old, because we thought it was nice to just be able to pick up the kid and still kind of like move around. And I realized, I think that I have a picture that I can share with you later of Bern in Switzerland, where there's this, and this was the summer, so it was still hot, but you've got this little covered shaded area where you can walk. So you've got like the area to walk outside, and then you've got this area to walk inside. And then you had the benches that were not perpendicular to the way, like they were perpendicular to the direction of people walking. And I have a picture of breastfeeding my child, and it felt so good because it was it was a flat surface. I could spread out. I could sit with my legs, folded or however I wanted to. I wasn't looking at people. They were moving, perpendicular to me, and there was shade. And it was such a small design detail that I felt if every bench and if every city could have something like this in areas where you have more people walking for every, whatever, few hundred meters, wouldn't this change the way you could even change a diaper on that, because it was just a flat surface. There was nothing fancy about it. It was literally just built in. So there are these small details that you tend to appreciate, but also recognize when they're missing.
That makes sense. And it's always easier, or it's super important to work with people like you that have experienced that, or study the people that have experienced that, and build their feedback into how we design. What's a key sustainability lesson that city planners often overlook when designing spaces for families?
I mean, I would start with, I don't think we necessarily start with designing for children to begin with, right? Or families. I think our way of designing is often with the sustainability piece. You have architects and planners who are looking at sustainability, but they're missing designing for children and families. So I would say it's probably the other way around. But I would say one thing when it comes to sustainability and designing for children and families, these things are not mutually exclusive. If you're going to design if you're going to think of putting green infrastructure in a park or in a street, how you detail it out can make a big difference in how children and families use it. So really making it accessible, and then thinking of it as, hey, we're going to increase shade on certain routes. We're going to prioritize certain routes where children and families use more to get to the park or to the school or walk to certain amenities. Or the fact that when we're designing a playground, we're going to include stormwater management. We're going to include elements that have shade, that have turf, and can actually be more porous. And then you have ways that children can play and explore that nature area. Same with like thinking of our streets. Again, it's not designing safe streets is not mutually exclusive for designing safe streets for children and families. It's about just being sensitive to who will use that space and how they might use it. Is the key. And I often say that these goals are related. Like when you think of what is good for children, like, talking about nature, shade, cooler urban environments. So we want passively cool urban environments where you've got the shade, you've got more greenery. So it's not just all asphalt and cars and, concrete. That's good for children because they tend to have difficulty regulating their body temperatures compared to adults. And that's also good for the environment. That's also good for our energy bill. So these are all connected pieces. I think it's more important for us to recognize, someone recently said, no matter what design you do, you are impacting children and families. You just don't know how, right? So it's like, it's not about that, oh, if I do this, it's not going to have any impact. It will, but it's just being sensitive to how it will impact them and how can you actually improve versus making it harder for them to use that space.
Yeah, and it's not just about children and families. We also had an episode that touched on designing cities for minorities, actually the minorities of the minorities. So if we're talking about blind people, how can you design mobility so blind people feel safe? Or people in a wheelchair in Barcelona, the sidewalks are super narrow and there's trees in the middle, which is nice. At least we have trees in the city, but I can walk by. But if you're in a wheelchair, you're literally stuck in the middle of the sidewalk.
Yeah, and I do think that it often comes down to our priorities and our values, and that's why I keep saying cities for care. And like, if you value care, you would think differently, because it is not the problem of just space in our cities, especially not in American cities. I think we have a lot of space on the streets, in play areas. It is more about how you prioritize that use. Can you swap that parking lane and add an additional space for sidewalk and a bike lane? Are you willing to get rid of one travel lane in order to accommodate a different use and giving more space for walking or biking? Or are you willing to swap one travel lane for a dedicated transit lane so that the transit can be more efficient? So I think it really comes down to priorities, and it really comes down to what we value in a society of who should we be serving, who should our cities really start to cater to and center around. And I think if we start, and that's why I think the lens of child and family becomes interesting, because you're really talking about care and caregiving, but you are also talking about the minority, right? Like I feel that there are more specific nuances if you have physical disability, whether it's visual, whether it's mobility related, and those are the next level of it. But if you're talking about care and caregiving, then you want to care for every citizen, and you want to care for even the minority that might need a little extra so that everyone can benefit. And I think that it's about the lens that we use, and the priorities that we have.
As you said before, it's about working on it on all scales. It starts with, okay, what are our building zones? Where do we have homes? Where do we have hospitals? Where do we have like this 15-minute city mix? But it goes down to which materials are we using? How much shading elements do we have and all that?
Yeah, it's every detail, and it's really thinking of like different scales. And I think that's what's interesting. Like, you can think at every scale. But to me, I often say, like, it's also about good design, right? It's like air. Like, if when it's there, you don't even recognize that it's there because it's so seamless. And when it's not, you're like, I can't breathe. Like, there's no air here. And I think that's the point with the design piece of it too. Like, these details, like small details, like curb heights, and it can sound very nerdy, but they all make a difference. But they also start from like the very top approach of priorities and values to then how you define your policies, and then how you go into your programs and then projects.
Talking about good examples, are you happy to live where you're living, having a kid, or where would you live with your kids in an ideal world?
In an ideal world, I would have elements from different cities. I loved when we were in The Hague how much access to nature we had within like 5 to 10 minutes. So I would bring that element and the biking infrastructure from there. I think the community and the playgrounds could use some work here in Brooklyn and in New York in general. But I love the community and the access that, at least in the neighborhood that I have, we're very fortunate to have that access. And that's not true for the entire city. Like, for some children, they don't have access to good playgrounds. But just looking at like where I've lived in places, so I think I would have these different elements. I'd love to bring certain cultural elements from India and Delhi, where I grew up. So for me, I don't know if there's a perfect city, and it doesn't have to be a perfect city. I think we're always improving. We can always get better. So I don't know if I would have one city where we would live, but I would definitely like to bring different elements from different cities. I know, like, for example, Milan's doing some really amazing work with their bike share systems. And then, you've got Fortaleza doing some. So they're like Tirana doing some amazing, things with children and families. So I think there are cities that are doing some really incredible work. And I'd love to bring different aspects of those cities in this fictional city where I want to live.
Now, and if we go back to our cities, I mean, you have seen so many examples and you've talked about so many examples. If we continue designing the cities in the way we're actually doing it or currently doing it, what's the worst case scenario for children and in urban spaces 20 years from now?
I don't want to paint a picture and say it's all doom and gloom and everything that we're doing is bad. I think cities are really taking charge and recognizing, especially with climate and heat related aspects. You have cities like Miami that have, a really amazing, heat chief heat officer who's working with children and families and doing different things. So I do think that cities are doing um, are doing good work when it comes to thinking of nature, access to nature. Even in New York City, there's like this idea of like making sure every playground has shade. So the parks department's kind of looking into it. But I do think that if we don't keep this idea of children and families in front and center, we will have more missed opportunities. And when any kind of investment in cities, any kind of work and projects in cities takes a lot of effort. And once you do it, you're kind of setting the timeline for 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years, right? Like the New York City subway, for example, was designed hundreds of years ago. And we're still I mean, not hundreds, but, a while back, we're still benefiting from the way it was thought and the fact that it connects the city and people have that option. So it's really thinking of the fact that children, are only children for a few years of their lives, right? Like where early years are only 0 to 5. So every project that we do, if we want to impact the future of those that are going to be 25 in 20 years, then we need to act now and we need to start taking those decisions and really starting to center their needs now instead of thinking we fix it later. And then the second piece is because it takes so much effort to do it, you want to try and do it right. You want to try and do it the best you can so that the benefits, the future generation and their children, grandchildren can reap the benefits. So I would just say that it's less about the worst case scenario because we're already living the worst case scenario in some ways. We've got wildfires, we've got extreme heat, we've got a lot going on. We've got traffic fatalities are on the rise in some places. You've got, so air pollution is another challenge where 98% of children don't breathe clean air. So we're already living a lot of the worst case scenarios right now. So it's really about improving them to have the best case scenarios in future.
What would you say is like one thing that we need to focus on most in the next few months or years when planning cities?
From a climate perspective, I think taking climate adaptation as a key piece is very essential, especially for children and families, because it will take a while for us to not undo all the impacts, but when we're thinking of mitigation, it will take a while. Like whatever we start doing now to mitigate the impacts of the changing climate and kind of get that sustainability piece out, it will take some time. But what's really essential now is how do we very quickly adapt our infrastructure? How do we very quickly adapt our systems and our services? How do we adapt our playgrounds so that even today, like even in 3 months when it gets hot again in the northern hemisphere, children can still go out and play, and they're not burning themselves. They're not in unsafe conditions. Families can still be outside, and that sometimes it's just like from something as simple as a shade to splash pads. Like there are very small things that we can start to do to adapt our systems, or even having security nets and safety nets in place where for childcare systems or for hospitals, like having early warning systems, informing parents about when there's a heat wave coming, what to do. So there are these adaptation measures that I think that cities need to do now and today that will help us survive and actually make sure that young children, while they're still in their childhood, are healthy and can develop in a healthy way.
That's a beautiful finishing, actually. Thank you so much, Ankita. It has been a very interesting conversation. I loved bridging the gap between planning cities for children. In a way, children are also the best version of ourselves, right? It's like if I plan for a kid, I'm thinking about how would I plan if I would plan for my better self, right? And how that turns actually into a sustainable city in a way.
Yeah, I often say that children tend to slow us down, and they often also help us recognize the sense of urgency to change. And we can also learn a lot by just observing children. I think there's just, we don't need experts. We don't need someone like me advocating for children and families. If every designer just took like, you know, a few hours of the day and observed how children behave and play and how caregivers are, there's so much that we can learn from that.
That's true. Thank you so much, Ankita. If our listeners want to follow your work and see what else you do, where can they find you?
I'm most active on LinkedIn these days. So definitely you can find me on LinkedIn.
Cool. I'll link your LinkedIn profile in the description of the episode.
Thank you, Ladina. It was a lovely conversation, and thank you for such thought-provoking questions. They made me think a lot that I hadn't thought of in a while. So thank you for that.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at @LadinaShipf. Thanks.